It's time for Recipe of the Day. So I had a recipe go a little bit viral on Instagram and Facebook recently. It was actually a video that I was reposting from a while ago, but the comments just made me really happy. They were things like, oh my God, yes, and I need it now. And so I thought that I should tell you guys about this recipe again. It is that good. It is for smothered chicken thighs. Smothered chicken is a classic Southern dish, so this is just a take on that. What I love about this recipe is, well, it's like spicy and creamy, so those two things counter each other. But the other thing that I like is that you can play around with the flavorings. Like once you know how to make this basic chicken gravy dish, you can change the seasonings, you can add cheese, you can add vegetables, you can do all kinds of things to it, and it is delicious every time. I've probably tried like 10 variations since I've come up with this, so you are going to just adore it. I know it. Now, I've done my best to make this as simple as possible, this version of the recipe. A lot of the versions that I've seen have you start it on the stove and then transfer it to the oven, and then sometimes even back to the stove to thicken the sauce at the end. Just too many steps. I've just kept it on the stove the whole time, but you're using boneless, skinless chicken thighs, and so everything cooks pretty quickly, and it's not something you need to be worrying that you have to stand there for a long time making. The other thing is I love serving this with mashed potatoes, and if you're making mashed potatoes, you are already using the stove anyhow, so it's just all there. You're standing there, you're stirring, you're having a great time, and dinner is ready. Like I said, boneless, skinless chicken thighs are what I'm using. If you have bone in, you can totally use those. Take the skin off though, because it's not going to get really crispy because it's simmering in the gravy. So I would take the skin off before you start, and then you just cook it for a little bit longer once it's in the gravy. So it'll just be simmering for longer until it's not pink inside and internal temperature is 165 degrees Fahrenheit. You can use boneless, skinless chicken breast for this. I just recommend that you, instead of leaving them whole, slice through them. Like if you could make them into almost like cutlets. So you're going to take your chicken breast, put it on the cutting board, and then with your knife parallel to the cutting board, slice through the middle, and then you get 2 cutlets from that. And those are going to cook much more quickly actually than the thighs listed in the recipe, but they're going to be so tender. So you're going to brown them on both sides, and then like you're going to see, we're going to simmer them in the gravy. They're not going to need as long simmering in the gravy, okay? So you could do that instead of the boneless, skinless chicken thighs, but I don't know why you would, because boneless, skinless chicken thighs are so much better than chicken breast, but that's just my opinion. Okay, let's dive into this. You are going to start with a big mixing bowl, and you're going to put 1/3 cup of all-purpose flour in there, and then your seasonings. So you can just go in with 2 tablespoons of store-bought or homemade Cajun seasoning. I will link to my homemade Cajun seasoning recipe for you in the show notes for this podcast episode, or head over to the Cookful and you can search for it there. So you can do the 2 tablespoons of Cajun seasoning. Cajun seasoning usually contains salt though, so just make sure you don't add any other salt in this recipe. Or if you don't want to use a mix, you don't have one, you don't want to make one, instead to the flour, you're adding 1.5 teaspoons of onion powder, 1.5 teaspoons of paprika, 1 teaspoon of salt, 3/4 teaspoon of cayenne. That's quite a bit. It's going to be a little spicy. You can use less if you don't want it to be that hot. 3/4 teaspoon of garlic powder and 3/4 teaspoon of black pepper. Stir that up. Then you are adding your chicken thighs to this. Now, if you are using the boneless, skinless, which is what I recommend, you know how they come on that tray from the grocery store, kind of like rolled into a bundle, rolled over where the bone would have been that was removed? You want to unroll those so that we get those flatter cutlets. They're going to cook more quickly, and we can get more surface area to put all our seasoning. If we leave them in that little bundle, you don't have as much surface area. So you unroll them, and then you put them into that bowl with the seasoned flour and just toss them all around until they're evenly coated. There really is just so much flavor on that chicken at this point. You see what I mean? Next, you're going to heat a large skillet over medium-high heat. I like to use a cast iron for this, but you can use non-stick skillet, like whatever you've got. You want something big, and it's great if it has a lid because we're going to need the lid later, or like anything that's going to fit over it. If you don't have a lid for the pan, you always can use like a sheet pan over top or some aluminum foil. If you're like me and you have a gas stove, you just need to be careful because sometimes the heat from that gas can make your pan really hot if you're using a pan over top. So just be aware of that. So you're heating that large skillet over medium-high heat, and you're adding 2 tablespoons of cooking oil. My go-to is usually like a grapeseed oil, something with a slightly higher cooking point, smoking point than like your olive oil and like neutral flavor. That's what I want here. I don't want to taste olive oil. But if you love cooking with olive oil, use the olive oil. Once your oil of choice is hot, you are adding those chicken thighs in a single layer. If your pan's not big enough, you might have to do 2 batches because we have 6 boneless, skinless chicken thighs and we've unrolled them. So they're not tiny, you know? Okay. So you are going to pick up the chicken out of the bowl that has the flour in it and shake it off, keeping the flour in that bowl, and then transfer the pieces to your hot pan. Do not throw out the flour. We're going to use it in a minute. So you're shaking off the excess flour before you add it to the frying pan, and then you're cooking them until they're well browned underneath, about 4 to 5 minutes. Then flip them over and do the other side, another 4 to 5 minutes. Then transfer them to a plate. You don't need to cover them or anything, but you can. It doesn't really matter. And then immediately reduce the heat to low and add a tablespoon of butter to there. And then as soon as that butter melts, you're adding 1 large onion that you sliced up. And you're just cooking that over low until it's softened a little bit, 3 to 4 minutes. And then you're stirring in 2 cloves of garlic that you've minced up. Stir that in, cook it for 30 seconds. And then to that, you're adding all of that leftover flour. The seasoned flour is going into that skillet. Stir that so that all the onions are coated, and then slowly drizzle in 2 cups of chicken broth and then half a cup of heavy cream. Now, I will just say, if you do not want to use heavy cream, you don't have to, but you can't just substitute a different dairy product here because we're going to be simmering it for a little while and it can curdle. Anything that has a lower fat content than heavy cream is at risk of curdling here. So if you don't want to use the heavy cream, I would say just don't add anything other than the chicken broth at this point. And then later at the very end, you can drizzle in a little bit of whole milk or a little bit of evaporated milk or a little half and half. That's going to be fine. But you want to do that at the end and just warm it through gently, not do the simmering that we're about to do because it'll curdle for sure. Having said all that, if you do this and it curdles, it is still totally edible. It is still totally safe. It just looks a little weird. So just that's why we don't want it to happen, right? Okay, so you've added the chicken broth and the cream to the pan. Give it a stir. It's essentially mixing with the flour and starting to thicken a little bit. Now is when you transfer your chicken back into the skillet. You want it in a single layer, like overlapping as little as possible, all the 6 chicken pieces in there, and then spoon the sauce over the chicken and then bring it up to a simmer over medium-high heat. Reduce it down to low. We just want a really gentle simmer, and that is when you cover it and you are cooking it there on low, covered until the chicken's no longer pink in the middle and is 165 degrees Fahrenheit. It's going to be about 10 to 12 minutes for those boneless, skinless chicken thighs. If you had the bone-in ones, it's going to be more like 20 to 25 minutes. And, you know, if you had those thinner chicken breast cutlets that I was talking about, they might only need a few minutes. They might have been fully cooked just from the pan frying earlier, and now you're just heating them through in the gravy a little bit. Okay, so once your chicken is done, you're going to take the cover off completely, and if you want your sauce a little bit thicker, you can then increase the heat a little bit and simmer it for 3 to 5 minutes until it's just a little bit thicker, and then you're going to serve those chicken pieces with the sauce and the onions, ideally on top of mashed potatoes, but rice would be my second choice. Maybe some egg noodles. I haven't tried that yet, but I bet that would be delicious too. Okay, I will put the link to this recipe in the show notes for this podcast episode, or you can head to cookthestory.com/ROTD and get it there. Everything there is arranged by date, so it's helpful to know that today is July 15th of 2025. And if you love this recipe and you want to see all those comments and other recipes that I have videos for, check me out on social media. I am Cook the Story everywhere that I'm at, and that is generally Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram, also Pinterest. I'm Christine Pittman from cookthestory.com, thecookful.com, the all-new chicken cookbook, and from this podcast, Recipe of the Day. I hope you have a great day. Let's get cooking.